Hi there, welcome to our first lesson, Conversation Map Design. In this lesson, we'll focus primarily on how to design the bot by creating a scenario, some conversations, scenes, and turns. Now, here is an overview of the conversational map of the Power of OpenDialog. I would advise that you download this image and reference it regularly as we build our bot throughout the series. This will give us a good overview of the overall design of our bot. All right, now let's dive straight into it. In front of us, we are seeing the logged in screen. And once you have logged in, we shall begin by creating a scenario. A scenario is meant to encapsulate a set of related conversations that are all focused on helping the user achieve a specific high-level goal. Once you've clicked the Create New Scenario button, you should be redirected into this page, which will be where you will name your scenario and describe your scenario's goal. Now, as mentioned earlier, the name of our scenario is the Power of OpenDialog. And remember that the project goal is that this bot demonstrates some of the capabilities and features of OpenDialog's web chat interface. Once you've typed in all of this, all you need to do is click on the Create Scenario button. All right, well, that was easy, and you've just made your first scenario. Now, for the first level down, we'll take a look at creating conversations. Conversations capture the exchanges for smaller specific goals on the way to the larger scenario goal. Now, if we were to think of the overview of our bot, it will primarily focus on helping users view and understand what particular user interface features are available to them. This includes buttons, rich messages, special messages, forms, and chat controls. We shall use these objectives as conversations that will be contained in our scenario. Now, immediately you've created your scenario, you will be redirected into this conversation view. And note that once you've been directed to this view, OpenDialog has gone ahead and created a few default conversations to get you started. This includes the welcome conversation, no match conversation, and the trigger conversation. Now, the welcome conversation is the default starting conversation. More on that later. It has one scene and one turn within the scene, which are both starting as well. It contains a default intent that maps to the event of a user first interacting with our web chat widget. It only happens the first time a conversation has started and will not be repeated again unless the conversation has restarted. The no match conversation is where the conversation engine will direct the user when all attempts to interpret a user message have failed. Now, the trigger conversation is created to handle the welcome event from web chat as well as the global restart. To learn more about these default conversations, be sure to check out docs. Now, let's create our first conversation. All we need to do is click on this plus button at the bottom, and our first conversation will be buttons. With regards to the behavior, we will not select starting because this is not an entry conversation into the entire scenario. Note that because our bot is button driven, we will only be making use of the default interpreter. We will also not be making use of any custom conditions because this bot will not have any complex logic. Cool, and that's it. You've done your first high-level conversational design. Next, we'll take a look at creating the scenes. Scenes focus on even smaller aspects of a conversation containing different stages of a single conversation. Let's start with buttons. In this particular case, buttons can be divided into finding out about the different button behaviors or different button functionality. So those will be our scenes. Let's begin by creating our first scene, the welcome scene. It'll be the starting scene with the starting behavior, as it will be the first one considered if it is the first time we interact with a specific conversation. Next, we'll create the button behavior scene. This scene will not have a starting behavior because this scene will only be transitioned into by the welcome scene mentioned earlier. Next, we have button functionalities. This will also not have a starting behavior for reasons mentioned earlier. Note that we haven't changed the interpreter and will not be changing the interpreter because this is a button-driven bot, and as a result will not need any NLU integration. It will also not need any custom conditions because there isn't any complex logic. All right, once you've created scenes for all the other conversations, we are now left with one more step to building the overall conversational context. Finally, we'll take a look at the turns. Turns capture single exchanges and consists of the user and application exchanging intents. In our case, there are two types of turns. Turns that are directly related to the scene's objectives and turns that are used for the navigation of the conversation or scenes or turns. Let's start by taking a look at the welcome user scene. Now, with regards to the scene objective, we will have the welcome turn, which will primarily focus on welcoming the user. This scene will have a starting behavior, but will not have an open behavior. This is because open turns are considered only after you've joined a scene, and they are always considered while you are in the scene. This is not necessary because we will not need to welcome our users into the scene multiple times. Next, we have the next turn. This turn will be used for scene navigation. It will enable us to transition into the other different scenes within the conversation. This includes the button functionalities and the button behaviors. It will also give us the ability to explore other conversations. And now for explore more. This will not be a starting turn, but will be an open turn. This turn will focus on providing the users with the ability to navigate to different conversations. More on this will be covered when we take a look at intent. And that's it for the turns within the welcome user scene. Now let's take a look at the button functionalities scene. Our welcome turn in this case will be describe functionalities. This will have both a starting behavior and an open behavior. As the name accurately states, this turn's objective is to describe the different button functionalities that are available. This includes the simulating intents and URL buttons. The next turn that we'll create fulfills one of the scene's objectives, which is showcasing the URL buttons functionality. This turn will only have an open behavior. This is because this turn will be transitioned into by a navigation turn. Next, we have simulating intents, which is similar to URL buttons because its objective is to showcase the simulating intent functionality. So it will also only have an open behavior. Next, we have the next turn. The objective of this turn is to be able to navigate within the scene. This will have an open behavior as it will be transitioned into and will be the means to navigate to the simulating intents, URL buttons, and to the button behaviors scene. Now let's briefly take a look at button behaviors. Note that we will not go into depth of describing all of the different turns because they are very similar to the turns that exist within button functionalities. The only difference being that instead of simulating intent and URL buttons, we will be having disappearing buttons, main interaction buttons, and disabled user input. What's important to note here is that the pattern is relatively the same, where you have the two different types of turns, which deal with the scene objective and the scene navigation. And that's it for turns. Now for our next lesson, where we focus on building intents.